From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's exchanges and clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
I'm a nostalgic guy. I think a lot about history and milestones and the stuff that went before. So how does one mark the passage of time? Typically through days, months, weeks, and years, the turn of the calendar, or maybe milestones in life like birthdays, new schools, changed jobs, and moving to a new city. Or how about podcast episodes? Or maybe midterm or presidential election cycles, a war, maybe even a pandemic. On that score, the years 2020 and 2021 have become synonymous. With our guest today, the passage of time can be marked through everything I just mentioned. Congressman Hill, the 5-term representative from Arkansas's 2nd District, first joined the podcast in July 2018, really just when we were getting started here on Inside the Ice House. Needless to say, a lot has changed in those past 5 years. Let's take stock a little bit. Since our first meeting here in the library back in 2018, Representative Hill has won 3 additional congressional elections in the natural state. His home state governor at the time of our last meeting, Asa Hutchinson, is now a presidential candidate, joining Mike Huckabee and my old boss, Bill Clinton, trying to make the move from the mansion at 1800 Center Street in Little Rock to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. And in that same span, Representative Hill has had a front row seat to watch the end of former President Trump's term and the first half of President Biden's term, bisected, of course, by the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which so radically flew in the face of the American tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. And through it all, of course, Congressman Hill has served in office throughout the tumultuous COVID-19 pandemic and the outbreak of the ongoing war in Ukraine. To use pandemic language, what an unprecedented 5 years it has been, marked by these defining moments in which Congressman Hill has been representing Arkansas in our nation's capital. In a minute, our encore conversation with Congressman Hill on his congressional service since we last spoke, the debate and passage of the debt ceiling legislation, the evolution of the debate over digital assets, and the challenges in U.S. foreign policy. That's all coming up right after this.
Connecting to opportunity is just part of the hustle.
Opportunity is using data to create a competitive advantage.
It's raising capital to help companies change the world.
It's making complicated financial concepts seem simple.
Opportunity is making the dream of home ownership a reality.
Writing new rules and redefining the game.
And driving the world forward to a greener energy future.
Opportunity is setting a goal
and charting a course to get there.
Sometimes the only thing standing between you and opportunity is someone who can make the connection.
At ICE, we connect people to opportunity.
Our guest today, Hill, has represented Arkansas's 2nd District in Congress since January 2015. He serves as Vice Chairman of the House Financial Services Committee and as Chairman of the Subcommittee on Digital Assets, Financial Technology, and Inclusion. Congressman Hill is also a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And somewhat unique and refreshing among his colleagues, Mr. Hill has extensive experience in the realm of financial services, having served as founder, chairman, and CEO of Delta Trust and Banking Corporation prior to his congressional service. He began his career in public service as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Corporate Finance and Executive Secretary of the President's Economic Policy Council under the Bush 41 administration. Talk about nostalgia for the good old days. Welcome back to the Ice House, Representative Hill.
Josh, great to be back. Wonderful to be with you, and it's a pleasure to be back at the New York Stock Exchange.
What brings you back in town this trip?
Well, I had a little political business to take care of in the state, and then spent some time today in New York seeing friends and doing a little media early this morning. And it's hard for me to come to New York and not come by and see you and my friends at the New York Stock Exchange.
You're no stranger to this city, as we talked about it the last time. You've been coming here for decades. What's your favorite stuff to do when you've got a little extra time in the city?
Well, one of my favorite places to go is someplace no stranger to the New York Stock Exchange. I had lunch today at the Morgan Library and went through their new exhibits on drawings from France and drawings from Fontainebleau. Really a great collection, and it just reminds me of the importance of American history across the street from the New York Stock Exchange at 1 Wall Street, and then all that transpired in J.P. Morgan's library.
Well, talk about Morgan and talk about history. When you were last on, we played an ad in support of your campaign in 2014 about a historic old car, Old Blue. And you got back behind the wheel for another spot in the recent campaign. Let's take a listen.
It all began with Old Blue.
My dad's been driving Old Blue since before I was born.
It's embarrassing.
Kids are out of high school now, but I'm still here, driving Old Blue. Some things will never change. Washington's a mess. But for the past 4 years, I've been your voice, fighting for change, rising above the dysfunction and noise to deliver real results for Arkansas families. I cut taxes for families and businesses, helping create good jobs and a booming economy. And now, wages are growing at their fastest level since the Great Recession. But look, our work isn't done. We must continue to steer our great country back on the right track. This means lowering the cost of health care, ensuring that families that have a pre-existing condition are covered, and protecting Social Security and Medicare. I'm French Hill, and I approve this message because I'm not quitting on Old Blue, and I'll never quit fighting for the good people of Arkansas.
French, I watched that ad this morning, and you're trying to keep your eyes straight on the road, but certainly the cameras are rolling. Did your constituents look at the ad and say, Congressman, we're worried about you getting in an accident as you're rattling off your legislative accomplishments?
Well, the best part about it, I did have my seatbelt on and I was not texting, so I made it through the ad shoot.
Since you first ran for the House in 2014, you've now run and won 5 campaigns. And your last campaign, you trounced Quintessa Hathaway, 60% to 35%, which is a lot more comfortable margin than your 2014 race when you beat Pat Hayes, 51.9 to 43.6. What are the few key differences between your various campaigns, and how has the district evolved over the years, you think?
Boy, that's a great question, because it has evolved. You know, Arkansas was the last southern state essentially to become red. Texas maybe I would consider being the first state under John Tower and Bill Clements in the late 70s and early 80s. And Arkansas, due to the leadership, frankly, of your old boss, Bill Clinton, stayed in the Democratic camp for a long time. But by 2010 and then in 2012, it went all red. So my first campaign, I felt very confident that I could beat Pat Hayes, longtime Democratic mayor for North Little Rock, been in office 25 years. It was a close race, but I felt like the voters were becoming more conservative center-right, and it's continued to grow that way. The Republicans have a supermajority now in the state legislature. They have all 5 constitutional seats, and our congressional delegation is 100% Republican. So it's definitely gotten more red, Josh. Redistricting, and this is fun because you are a history buff, this is the first redistricting 2020, as controversial as people want to make it around the country, that were done by Republicans since 1872 during Reconstruction. So if you have any complaints about the congressional districts in Arkansas up until this point, they were all done by Democratic legislatures and Democratic governors. So that my district is slightly more Republican in that redistricting, not dramatic, but slightly more so.
That district was held in Democratic hands for 20 years, from 1991 to 2011, between Ray Thornton and Vic Snyder. And, is there anything that a Democrat can do to sort of try to create a blue wedge in this state at this point, or is it locked up, you think?
I think it really has. We're going through a phase where I think right now it's center-right, it's solidly Republican, and you see now at the most important level of politics in America are counties our county quorum courts is what they're referred to in Arkansas. Those are seeing people change party identification and simply running now as a Republican, or you have Republican competition at that level. So at the county level, you're now seeing more Republicans elected. The exception, of course, is the county, my hometown of Little Rock, Arkansas, is very Democratic, and the quorum court is as well.
Regardless of party affiliation, French, I was talking to my Little Rock buddy Steve Rennell this morning, who marveled at your ability to transition from a community business leader in the Rotarian community to an office in the Capitol. And we certainly need more French Hills with business acumen in Congress. What advice do you have to listeners who think they might be more effective in their seat in their hometown than, say, George Santos?
Oh, boy. Well, pretty much anyone in the phone book maybe on that, but no offense. But look, here's the way I look at that. 750,000 people are in each of these congressional districts approximately, and they work and they elect somebody. And you hope that's elected on a clear, transparent, fair election with all the information you need to know to make that choice. And that's why you see leadership in Congress a little reluctant to see what I've seen a lot of, both under Nancy Pelosi and even under Kevin McCarthy, which is this retribution issue where we're supposed to reach across the aisle and discipline somebody in another party. McCarthy has been very reluctant to do that. Speaker Pelosi was not, did it routinely because she just plain disagreed with somebody. Mm-hmm. But you're really violating a 200-year precedent, which is that parties are to discipline their own. So in the case of George Santos, representing here part of southern New York, he's been referred to the Ethics Committee and was prior to the recent indictment. And that works its course. That's deemed fair, a more fair way to go about that sort of reaching across the aisle. But as I say, I've seen it now, both parties, and I don't like it, and I think a lot of people don't care for it.
But the broader question is sort of answering the call to service. And you had a good life, and you were a pillar of the community, and you thought you could be effective in Washington, and you put yourself out in Old Blue and asked for the voters' support. And we all benefit from the great amount of financial services experience that you bring compared to the other guy, and plenty of other people who sort of see a couple terms in Congress as a stepping stone to a gig on Fox News. Yeah. How can we get more French Hills in Congress? Fair point.
Yeah, I chased down the rabbit hole you led me to.
Sorry.
I saw the rabbit go down. I couldn't resist. I'm 10 feet underground right now chasing that story. But look, I'm a recidivist. This is my third tour of duty in Washington. Each time I came up, I served in Washington, the people, and then I returned to the private sector, and that'll happen again here at some point. I served 2 years in the Senate, on the Senate Banking Committee staff for John Tower of Texas, and then 4 years for President Bush 41, and was proud at mid-career to step away from the private sector again, take that 35 years then, or 30 years of experience in finance, and bring it to Washington specifically. It's why I worked so hard as a freshman to get on House Financial Services Committee, is I wanted to take that economic policy-making experience and practical investment banking and commercial banking experience and bring that to the debates. And I think I have made a contribution there, which is one that I always encourage people with private sector experience. Please come run for public office. We need your practical viewpoint.
So, French, on a tougher note about what's happening back in the district, on March 31st this year, a catastrophic tornado touched down in Little Rock. I want to hear a little bit from my friend Phil Lipoff reporting for ABC News that day.
Go, 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 go!
Earlier, the emergency unfolding in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Take your tornado precautions now. You're looking live right now, north of Little Rock. That is the lowering, and there's a tornado in there. This is not a drill. This is confirmed.
It's going to hit the radio tower. Go.
Storm chasers tracking the massive, fast-moving twister as it heads into the north side of the city of 200,000 people. This neighborhood taking a direct hit, downing trees, shearing roofs, splintering homes, and tossing vehicles everywhere.
I hear glass breaking, all of this kind of stuff. Man, it come through so fast, within a matter of seconds, it's just dead silent. And then you come outside and you see all this.
Little Rock's fire chief telling ABC News there are significant injuries.
Talking to Steve Rennell, French, he said everyone was amazed there weren't more injuries than actually happened. But he still said that the drive to his mother's house that used to take 10 minutes then took an hour and a half. But even more amazing still was how neighbors helped neighbors in the aftermath. How's everyone doing now?
Everybody is doing well. They're in shock, but God is good because really only one older man in the Amboy section of town lost his life. A tree fell in the house and killed him, and it's a miracle. It was at 2:30 in the afternoon, basically, on a weekday. Plenty of notice. Lots of notice. People on TV, radio, their cell phones were going off, and I think that accounted for a lot of the personal safety and the fact that people were at work or still possibly at school or in transit. And it's an amazing story of neighbor helping neighbor. One Entergy employee I met with was such a great story. He was off that day. He lives in an apartment complex right in the center of the storm. He's kind of racked, early afternoon, he's not working. He's in his bed. The sirens go off. Instinct says, get under the bed. His whole roof of his apartment complex was torn off. He took one day off, and then he spent the next 3 weeks, 16 hours a day, helping people get their electricity back on. And that's a classic American story of his responsibility, neighbor helping neighbor. But it's devastating, and I hate it. These were neighborhoods I grew up in as a kid that were the worst hit, and it's changed the topography, but we're all blessed that so few were seriously injured and only one killed there. Now, in Wynne, Arkansas, we had more injured. And what devastated as we record this, we've just heard about Amarillo, north of Amarillo and Perryton, Texas. Congressman Jake Elzey's hometown was hit this morning, and no siren notices, So we're blessed by these notification systems.
Widening the aperture a little bit to the nation as a whole, during COVID-19, the New York Stock Exchange made the unprecedented move to close its trading floor for 9 weeks and move our market model to a fully electronic platform. Now, we quickly reopened the floor, but learned some valuable lessons. What was it like serving in the House during that time, and how has its operations been changed by COVID?
Boy, it was it was just, like for a lot of Americans, honestly, it was a dystopian experience. I didn't believe in proxy voting. Speaker Pelosi authorized it. I still don't believe it's constitutional, not worth debating here. I believe a quorum has to be established by physical presence. I recognize all the concerns about that. So, as a result, I flew to Washington every week back to work, and I would be on a full American or Delta Airlines flight. I know you usually quote the stock symbol at this point of the show. And they're empty. It's a traveling nurse with her backpack and one or two other people. And it was like that for weeks.
In the midst of the pandemic, we also witnessed another presidential election. Talk about another transition from President Trump to President Biden inside those same halls of government. Where were you on January 6th?
January 6th, I was in my office in the Longworth building, and I had just eaten lunch, and we had gotten a warning on our cell phones around 11 o'clock Eastern time about these bomb threats at the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. And they'd closed the Cannon building, which is near the Republican National Committee offices. That got everybody's attention. I'd been in the Capitol all morning. I'd met with Minority Leader McCarthy that morning. And out of the front of the Capitol, we saw the protesters out the window and went back to my business. But just as I was about to walk over to the Capitol to listen to the Arizona debate, we got the word to stay, in our offices. And it began, and I could hear the tear gas canisters going off, and could look out my window and see the south lawn of the Capitol from the Longworth building, and I was in disbelief.
As I mentioned in the intro, you spent over a decade before you got to Congress as the founder and CEO and chairman of Delta Trust and Banking. How was your career making sure that you could actually make payroll, serve your customers, stay solvent, lent itself to your role as vice chair of the House Financial Services Committee and your role in Congress generally?
Well, I'll start with Congress generally. It's about customer service. And being in Congress is about constituent service, being in touch, listening, representing the people, using your judgment that's our principal goal. If you're elected to public office, we're electing you to not do everything we agree with, but to use your judgment. So I think that's the same case in running any kind of a business. You have that fiduciary obligation. So I've taken that to my work generally. In my role in financial services, it's about how do we create a diverse, effective financial services system that does not concentrate power in too few hands. And this has been, of course, a theme of American history, a theme of American government policy. But technology has driven so much consolidation in American business generally and finance specifically that I think what we're trying to do is make sure that government mandates, government regulation, government policy doesn't make it too hard to become a public company and that companies stay private for too long. We have 50% fewer public companies than when I graduated from Vanderbilt. But that's also true over here in finance, where we keep concentrating that authority in fewer and fewer hands. The secret, I think, to one of America's great economic secrets of America's success has been this diverse, small, large, medium-sized financial system of credit unions, banks, small banks, community banks, entrepreneurial banks, large, sophisticated global banks, all rolled into one. And the same can be said for the insurance business and for the investment business. And I think that's given America a lot of strength.
Okay, but in finance, if, as you say, the goal is to have a diverse system and avoid consolidation in too few names. This year's seen a number of high-profile failures with Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, my own bank, First Republic, which has resulted in the entire sector coming under pressure. What role should and does Congress play in remediating the situation and preventing something like this from happening again?
Right. First, I think that we have some unprecedented reasons for the failure, particularly of Silicon Valley, a lack of urgency and supervision with no laws being passed or added or subtracted, meaning they just did not do their job. Secondly, a management strategy that is classic bad decision-making that most bankers would accept as bad decision-making, which is able to be seen in full flight by looking at their financial statements over those 2 years. And then thirdly, customers. Where's the customer's responsibility in being a good monitor and good fiduciary for their own resources, that you would really put $200 million in your checking account in one bank? That seems like not a smart thing to do to me. So our policy should be, and I've argued this even since the 2008 crisis, we should qualify a much broader list of people to buy failed institutions and not have them be concentrated in the FDIC. A couple of to the top, say 10 banks. A couple of ideas. Mm-hmm. One, we've statutorily said you have to come up with the least cost resolution when a bank fails. True enough. But in the case of your bank, First Republic, we did two things. We waived the deposit cap on JP Morgan Chase, and because it was going to be the least cost solution. So my suggestion is we ought to pre-qualify people to buy banks that are failed and also pre-qualify them for merger capabilities. So that if you have an outstanding executive, outstanding capital system, we ought to encourage them to be out there in line to acquire another institution, failed or not. And that would, I think, broaden the potential owners. And we saw it in spades, obviously, back in 2008.
We talked about, French, how you've cut your teeth in your career here a little bit. You've visited here many times in your role of Congress. I think the most recent visit was April 17th when Speaker McCarthy delivered his economic address live from our boardroom. I want to just take a quick listen to that part of that speech.
Okay, so here's our plan. In the coming weeks, the House will vote on a bill to lift the debt ceiling into the next year. Save taxpayers trillions of dollars, make us less dependent upon China, curb our high inflation, all without touching Social Security and Medicare. Simply put, it puts it on a fiscal responsible path in three ways. It limits, it saves, and it grows.
Limit, saves, and grows. I watched the coverage of that event play out for days, and it really did set the stage for Speaker McCarthy's ultimately successful negotiations with President Biden. What were your impressions of that day, and why was it important to take the debate out of Washington sometimes like you did right down the hall from here?
Well, it was a great day for our country and for Speaker McCarthy, and he purposely wanted to come to the private sector, to the heart of America business, the New York Stock Exchange in New York, to lay out that message that we've got to go back to a pre-pandemic outlook on spending. If we're serious about fiscal stability, if we're serious about treating our kids with respect, and if we're serious about being the reserve currency of the world, we put all that at risk when we don't have an organized fiscal situation. We're running $1.5 trillion deficits a year. And between the pandemic, say 2019, and today, discretionary spending in our country, it's 40% higher. I mean, we're spending $2 trillion more per year than we were when I joined Congress. Now, a lot of that was essentially, I'll use the term, green-lighted and expanded in the pandemic and in the early years under Speaker Pelosi and Joe Biden's spending plans. All we're saying is we're trying to flatten that growth curve out, which is what the Speaker came here to talk about, and he wanted to get business to align with us in our thinking. Limit, save, grow, and do that for the long haul. And all this was an opening act, a tiny first step in a much tougher journey, I think.
A tiny first step in a much tougher journey, French. But when the legislation passed, President Biden sat down at the Resolute desk in the Oval Office for his first such address to the nation. Just want to take a little listen to that comment.
I know it's taken years to climb out of that hole. And America's standing as the most trusted, reliable financial partner in the world would have been shattered. So, it was critical to reach an agreement. And it's very good news for the American people. No one got everything they wanted, but the American people got what they needed. We averted an economic crisis, an economic collapse. We're cutting spending and bringing the deficits down at the same time. We're protecting important priorities from Social Security to Medicare to Medicaid to veterans to our transformational investments in infrastructure and clean energy. I want to commend Speaker McCarthy. You know, he and I, we and our teams, we were able to get along, get things done. We were straightforward with one another, completely honest with one another, respectful with one another.
Bring us inside the room as best you can, Congressman Hill. I've heard you say on Bloomberg television that President Biden essentially got nothing out of this bill, and yet still about 2/3 of Senate Republicans voted against the debt ceiling bill. What happened here? A case of politics as usual or something bigger, perhaps an opportunity that both sides can negotiate and find accord?
Well, this is the secret of our legislative history in America. We have to do that. And I thought Speaker McCarthy did a fine job by bringing Republicans to the table with a plan that he highlighted here at the New York Stock Exchange. And as you said, that set the stage for a negotiation with the president. But the president for 100 days did not engage. And I think that's what's frustrating to me as somebody who's watched politics for a long time now. We're where we are, but we could have gotten there a lot sooner and had a lot less drama. And it reminds me of John Boehner's famous expression, which is Congress moves very slowly until it doesn't, because that was clearly the case here. But we asked for $2 trillion in spending cuts. We asked for $4 trillion in spending cuts. We got $2 trillion of spending cuts. We asked for 10 years to cap that growth at 1% a year to try to let us get back to some spending priorities. We got 6. We asked for a whole variety of things, but in each instance, we did get the president to compromise on some of his principal priorities. And so from that point of view, what I think Joe Biden ended up getting out of it was a debt ceiling increase that allowed him to continue on with his administration. And I would argue that's typically what happens when you have an opposition power in the Congress.
Well, 100 days could be seen as a long time and a waste of time, but ultimately it did get done by the date that we all knew was going to be the deadline. And coming out of it, Speaker McCarthy and President Biden could both create a sense of a victory lap for both of them. If that is any kind of a blueprint for how the two sides can come together and negotiate, even if you think that Biden just got what he needed, tick off some other things you think that McCarthy and Biden could work on together.
Well, I think the rest of the year is going to be challenging. I mean, we have to go through the appropriations bills. We have to pass 12 appropriations bills. We have to get those through the Senate. That's what we've set as a goal for House Republicans. But we also have a federal aviation authorization renewal. This is a farm bill year, and potentially the farm bill could be a place where the president and Speaker McCarthy could collaborate to get a good farm bill through. We do that every 5 years. So there are a number of legislative objectives to do this year, but I'd say the toughest, Josh, is going to be getting a spending deal. Even though the president and the speaker have set that top line spending, we still have to do the details now.
Still have to do the details. We're going to talk about some of those details in a second. After the break, Congressman French Hill and I talk about his recent work on the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Digital Assets, Financial Technology and Inclusion, as well as his view on world affairs and some of the things going on overseas, Ukraine, China, that kind of stuff. It's all coming up right after this.
Shopify Editions is back with over 100 product updates and enhancements all in one place. Explore our latest solutions for every aspect of commerce, from starting and scaling a business
so you can sell everywhere easier,
to flexible components for enterprise needs.
Businesses can choose which technologies they need to create the customer experience they want.
And developer tooling to customize any commerce experience.
We know how important it is to offer the right mix of power, flexibility, and customization across our surfaces.
No matter what you're building, you can build for the long term with Shopify. Visit shopify.com/editions.
Welcome back. Before the break, I was talking with Representative French Hill about his recent campaigns and congressional service since he last joined our Inside the Ice House podcast back in 2018, as well as the highly discussed banking crisis and the debt ceiling bill. You chair the Subcommittee on Digital Assets, Financial Technology and Inclusion, and you are also a co-sponsor of the new House bill introduced on June 2nd to create a market structure for digital assets to help identify which assets might fall under either the SEC's or the CFTC's jurisdiction. Congressman, can you give us a little overview of what is now called the Digital Asset Market Structure Discussion Draft?
So we want America to lead innovation. And if we think about the 1990s, Congress took a proactive stance to deregulate telecommunications, which gave us all the choice that led to the cellular revolution. And they also agreed not to tax the internet or regulate the internet, that in fact they would simply tax and regulate things that went on the internet, that it would run in the background. So as we think about Web3, and distributed ledger technologies and blockchain technologies applicable to all businesses of all shapes and sizes, we want to make sure America is just as innovative today as they were in those blossoming days of the internet in the 1990s. Big picture. Right now, I would argue we're not. We're behind. We're behind the United Kingdom. We're behind the EU. We're behind Singapore. We're behind some other jurisdictions. And these are jurisdictions that we respect. This is not the case where, somebody is using a cryptocurrency in El Salvador or the Bahamas. Not that we don't respect those two countries, but these are big marketplaces like the EU. So we want that, and we believe we don't have it under existing law. For example, in the commodities regulatory space here, there is no spot market for Bitcoin, for example. There is no definitions inside the commodities space for dealing in a digital asset of any kind. So the CFTC actually is asking for this regulatory framework and authority. The Presidential Working Group has identified it as an issue. The FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, has identified it as an issue. And over in stable coins, where you would use a dollar-based, fiat money-backed dollar stable coin that's a tokenized payment on a distributed ledger network, that's not regulated. So our view is let's craft that innovative framework. Let's use the Securities and Exchange Commission and the CFTC as the basis for that and allow Americans to innovate here, keep that innovation here, keep that oversight here, protect investors here, protect consumers here, because clearly that has not been happening in the past. And if the SEC claims they're the cop on the beat, I've seen no evidence of that because they let FTX end up with the largest set of creditors in history and collapse, taking down billions of dollars of American investments. And so that was, to me, the impetus to now get bicameral, bipartisan support for this kind of work.
Is the SEC the only impediment? Everything you say sounds rational. What are the roadblocks to getting enough bipartisan support in the House and Senate to pass it into law?
Well, we've had excellent technical assistance from the Treasury, from the Federal Reserve, from the Comptroller of the Currency, which regulates national banks. We've had some technical assistance, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, but we need more. We've had excellent cooperation with the Agriculture Committee, which we're doing this in tandem with because for a lot of listeners, our commodities regulatory system is actually overseen by the House Agriculture Committee, not the Financial Services Committee. So we're working cooperatively on this, and the last time we got to have this much cooperation was post-Dodd-Frank in the swaps, international swaps regulation. So I believe we've got a good direction. We just need to make sure that we work together to do this, because if we don't, we're leaving America in an uncompetitive position, and we're leaving investors confused, innovators confused, and actually fearful, frankly, about current SEC enforcement potential. And we're leaving consumers hung out without knowing what the rules are. And that's not a good place. So it's my hope that Chairman Patrick McHenry of the Financial Services Committee, Ranking Member Maxine Waters, can collaborate with our agricultural colleagues and bring this to the House floor.
In early March, you offered remarks at a hearing entitled "Coincidence or Coordinated? The Administration's Attack on the Digital Asset Ecosystem." I'm going to quote you here. You said, "I was glad to see Ranking Member Waters call the Treasury, Fed, CFTC, and the SEC to get together with Congress and address digital asset regulation. We can't have agencies trying to front-run the legislative branch," you said. In the same week, you introduced the bill and held a hearing. The SEC sued digital currency exchanges Binance and Coinbase. How does the SEC's actions impact your proposal?
They don't impact it directly, but they illustrate the need for our proposal. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Sure. In other words, I don't think we should ever do regulation by enforcement. Not at the New York Stock Exchange, not at Delta Trust and Banking Corporation. I think I don't want to say it's un-American, but it should be unnecessary, and only in the most dire circumstances should one go there. And perhaps you could say that, and I would argue if you think these are dire circumstances, if you're an enforcement attorney at the SEC, it's because you don't have statutory authorities to do this in the right way. And we believe we've crafted a process that leaves the SEC having the right tools to determine this is a security. This is not a security. This should be trading inside the securities rules, or this should be trading over in the commodities space, or it shouldn't be even regulated. It's just not relevant. And bringing those definitions, bringing that oversight, I think is precisely what we need to make sure that America can lead the way for that next generation of technological development.
You mentioned all of the creditors that FTX left in its wake a couple of minutes ago. The topic was a major focus of our recent episode with CME Group's chair, Terry Duffy. He and my colleague Chris Edmonds had appeared before Congress months before the FTX collapse, warning of the potential and later realized risk of the proposals that Sam Bankman-Fried had been putting forward. I want to listen a little bit to Terry's remarks in that hearing.
Under false claims of innovation that are little more than cost-cutting measures, FTX is proposing a risk management light clearing regime that would inject significant systemic risk into the U.S. financial system. The FTX model would come at the expense of proven risk mitigation practices, market integrity, and ultimately financial stability. In fact, the FTX proposal would significantly increase market risk by potentially removing up to $170 billion of loss-absorbing capital from the cleared derivatives market, eliminating standard credit due diligence practices, and perhaps most importantly, destroying risk management incentives by eliminating stakeholder capital requirements and mutualized risk.
Do you think that legislation like your digital asset market structure proposal, that government might be prepared to prevent another FTX-like collapse from happening?
I do, and I think our draft legislation reflects all of Terry's concerns. I really do. I think it addresses precisely the things that he's expressing concern about that were absolutely missing in some of the promotion by FTX in the Capitol of last year. So I think that's an important, critically an important point that he raises.
How did Sam Bankman-Fried get the foothold that he did and get so close to his goal?
Josh, I'm going to sound like a much younger version of Charlie Munger here, but we have a complete dearth in our society right now of due diligence, whether it's who you vote for or reading a bill before you vote on it or you make an investment. I was flabbergasted by who had given money to Sam Bankman-Fried for his proposal. And I even read in quotes in the Wall Street Journal where people said, well, we didn't do due diligence because we relied on, I'm not going to name the company, but a very well-known Silicon Valley-based venture capital company made a very significant contribution, so we know they know what they're doing. Well, that's the height of not doing due diligence or taking your own fiduciary responsibility. So he made a great presentation, and he, I think, being on the cover of Forbes magazine that summer, I guess it's just the halo effect that this guy's a revolutionary, successful person, and that's precisely, I think, the person somebody like Charlie Munger might run away from.
Well, if Charlie Munger were doing due diligence on another thing that is captivating a lot of our attention these days, they might be the threats that are posed by artificial intelligence. In 2019, as ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee Task Force on AI, you helped lead the newly formed task force in its first hearing entitled Perspectives on Artificial Intelligence, Where We Are and the Next Frontier in Financial Services. French, where is Congress now in passing legislation to protect the American people from what might be the potential threats of AI?
First of all, big picture, every committee is going to engage here in their areas of jurisdiction to think about AI, how it can be used, how it can be a force for good, how it can be a force for concern, the ethics around it, how to measure the oversight of it. So I think Congress is very engaged. I credit again Kevin McCarthy for this. He's asked every committee chairman to learn about this. He's actually invited AI experts to the House to testify and participate in roundtables with both Democrats and Republicans. And he's asked every Armed Services Committee member and Intelligence Committee member to go to MIT and take a course in AI. So we want to raise the level of understanding there so that people can have the right oversight mentality. In our early task force hearings of just a few years ago, we talked about, can it be a force for good? Will more people have more credit availability to them by virtue of AI mining big data to offer a better, more affordable credit product? And at the same time answering the question, can that be done more fairly with less bias and more successfully? And I think that's what you'll see the due diligence by each committee in their areas of jurisdiction.
Let's turn for a minute before we begin to sort of wind our way back here, French, to issues that are outside the United States. In May, you released draft legislation to force Russia to pay for its war damages in Ukraine. What's your stance on the U.S.'s involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war, and to what extent should we be allocating as many American resources as we are right now?
Well, my argument has been there are many reasons why Vladimir Putin chose to go into Ukraine. And one of them was that we were not unified and not forceful enough under President Obama's leadership and the EU's leadership back in 2014. It opened the door that there was a tepid response vis-a-vis Putin going into the Donbass region. And the pullout of America in Afghanistan was such a, I think, emotional and financial and military catastrophe that sent the wrong signal around the world. So I'm a strong believer that we should be supporting the ejection of Putin from Ukraine with our allies. And I would say three things. One, do we have full accountability on the money that's being spent by American taxpayers and European taxpayers for that matter? Two, can we channel Jim Baker, former Secretary of State Jim Baker, former Secretary of Treasury, my old boss, Nick Brady, and make sure we've got every commitment we can from freedom-loving countries around the world to help pay for this and minimize the impact on the American taxpayers outside our military support. And thirdly, we do need to make sure that we send a message of global unity in Asia and in Europe and around the world against a UN Security Council member attacking a sovereign country, because this will send a signal to Beijing that's critically important.
Talking about Beijing, in April, you traveled to Taiwan with a bipartisan delegation led by Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul. Tell us about that visit, as well as the two bills that you're working on, the Taiwan Conflict Deterrence Act and the SAVE Act, which were reported out of committee in February.
Well, I believe that while military deterrence is important in East Asia, and you certainly see that with the Philippines re-engaging with America. I was working for President George H.W. Bush when we were encouraged to leave the Philippines by the then Philippine government, Clark Air Force Base in Subic Bay. And now we're being invited back in partnership with the Japanese and the Koreans and others in the region. Asia is concerned about China's provocations, particularly in the Taiwan Strait, because 80% of seaborne freight passes through the Taiwan Strait bound for Japan or Korea. And so we know about military deterrence, and we're seeing that in our partner countries like Australia, the Philippines, the Quad, India, Japan, Korea. But economic deterrence is what I believe is one of the most important things. So anything we can do to deter bad behavior is what I want to. So my two bills do that. The Taiwan bill directly says that if you threaten militarily Taiwan, we're going to cut off your access to the U.S., your visas, your ability to travel here, your money in the United States if you're a CCP leader. And that's directed directly at that top echelon. And the SAVE Act is part of the effort to, like you see a lot of New York Stock Exchange companies taking on their own, which is to build a more resilient supply chain, less dependent on China. The biggest deterrent for China coming across the strait, in my opinion, is economic deterrence. And the people of Taiwan feel the same way. President Tsai is impressive. She quoted Margaret Thatcher. She quoted Winston Churchill. She's in sync with the Taiwanese people, who by and large want the status quo. They want their democracy. They want their economic freedom. They want their productivity. They don't mind being connected in this historic way to China, but they don't want to be absorbed by the mainland, and they don't seek independence. These are tiny minorities, according to Financial Times polling on the island, of under 10% for either unification or independence. So the vast majority want that, and I think they're willing to fight to keep it and help drive that deterrence, both economic deterrence and military deterrence.
As we wrap up, Congressman, on a personal note, my friend Steve Rennell reminded me that your amazing daughter has just graduated from med school and headed to Birmingham for her residency. Mazel tov on that. My dad just passed away at the age of 92, community pediatrician for 50 years in his hometown in Newton, Massachusetts. The direction of the healthcare economy was dispiriting to him as his career wound down. What's the world of medicine you think your daughter is going to encounter when she gets to Alabama?
Well, Liza Hill is an extraordinary young woman. She'll be an amazing, successful physician. She's going to, her goal is to complete 4 years of residency at Birmingham in OBGYN and then become a pediatric gynecologist. And that's her dream since she was in 5th grade, so she's headed for that dream. You know what's exciting to me, Josh, about people who pay that heavy price to go to med school and residency and fellowship, all those years of study, is they're about taking care of people. They're not studying the payment system. What we ought to do for them is reform our insurance system and then reform our hospital regulatory system to bring freedom and choice back to more people. And we just are stumbling around on that, looking for a solution. So what inspires me, just like your dad started his career, he ended his career frustrated with what he found, paperwork, bureaucracy, couldn't do what he wanted to, and I get it. But for Liza Hill, it's about caring for people and being on the cutting edge of innovation, and that's what medicine's all about, the Hippocratic Oath and their passion for it, and fortunately, they don't take a class in how they're going to get paid. I think it would be dispiriting to them. So they're focused on medicine. And I wish her well, and she's going to be a magnificent doctor.
Good luck to that. I can't wait to see how that turns out. As we leave this episode, sometimes we also take leave of the New York Stock Exchange and take our show on the road, which we did last week to Bentonville to ring the opening bell with our friends at Walmart, NYSE ticker symbol WMT. Delta Airlines, mentioned earlier, DL. Let's go back to Bentonville to hear a little bit of the announcement of his presidential candidacy from Governor Hutchinson.
I was born in the old Bentonville Hospital. My first law office was across from the square from where we stand today. I tried jury trials in this courthouse behind us. I built Bentonville's first FM radio station. I served as Bentonville's city attorney. But most importantly, this is where Susan and I started our family and spent some of our happiest years living on 15 acres of rocks and hills west of town in a double-wide mobile home.
Like Bill Clinton before him, is it still possible for a kid from a double-wide mobile home in Arkansas to make it to America's home in the White House? Or is that now a place reserved for real estate millionaire's son from Queens? And what are your thoughts on the Republican field taking shape, and where do you see the 2024 race headed? Does Hutchinson have a role to play in it?
Well, first, Asa spent 8 years as governor, successful career in the House of Representatives, youngest U.S. attorney in American history, appointed by President Reagan. Remarkable career and a great public servant. I think absolutely that's the beauty of America, is that we have this diversity of people who can rise to the top job, but it's a long, hard battle to get there. I think Asa plays a role in the campaign because he's a successful governor. I think traditionally successful governors, as you well know, have a great road to the White House capability. My personal vision about 2024 is I wish both parties would nominate somebody younger. Mm-hmm. And it's just the way I feel. It's just a personal opinion. And I would love for somebody who could be eligible to serve 2 4-year terms, because I don't like the direction of our economy. I don't like the direction of our regulatory policy, our spending policy. I've tried every year I've served in Congress to head it in a better direction as one member of the legislative branch. And so that would be my hope, is that we have a vigorous debate and some new voices enter that debate from both political parties.
We haven't seen many voices on the Democratic side who are ready to rise up and challenge President Biden, except kind of an interesting set of comments from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but some interesting talent coming through and some younger talent coming through on the Republican side.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, I know listeners really have seen replays of Tim Scott's inspirational message from South Carolina, and sort of this Chris Christie post-governorship, post-presidential run. Several years have gone by, and Chris Christie, I thought, answered questions really well the other night. So we've got some great people. I've served with Nikki Haley. I thought she did a very good job at the United Nations. So I love the fact that our bench is deep and broad. It's black, it's white, it's male, it's female, it's younger, it's dynamic, including some people who chose not to throw their hat in the ring. And I would just urge my friends on the Democratic side of the ledger, reach out, let's see what you've got at your bench, because right now we're not, I don't consider Bernie Sanders a bench.
You were sitting behind this microphone in 2018. You've come back in 2023, 5 years later. Please, sir, don't be a stranger. Will you come back next year and sort of see where all this is headed and all the things that we've talked about?
Wouldn't that be fun? Great to be with you, Josh. Thanks.
Always, Congressman Hill. Thanks for coming. And that's our conversation for this week. Our guest was Congressman French Hill, the representative from the 2nd District of Arkansas. If you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks can know where to find us. And if you've got a comment or a question you'd like one of our experts to tackle on a future show, email us at icehouse@ice.com or tweet at us at Icehouse Podcast. Our show is produced by Lauren Sullivan and Pete Ash, with production assistance from Ian Wolfe. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the library of the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information, and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.